For more than a century, Campbell's sold America one powerful idea that comfort comes in a can. Red and white. Simple. Safe. Untouchable. But then one recording shattered that illusion in seconds. A Campbell's vice president caught on tape, tearing into his own company's food, mocking the customers who buy it, and hinting at things inside the can that no brand ever once said out loud. The clip spread like wildfire because it confirmed something millions have quietly wondered for years. Has Campbell's been slipping? Has the company that fed America's childhood slowly become a machine that even its own executives don't trust? What happened next wasn't a PR problem, it was a reckoning. Consumers questioning ingredient lists, lawmakers demanding answers, shareholders watching the brand's most valuable asset, trust, begin to fracture. But the real story didn't start with a rant in a restaurant. It started decades earlier inside boardrooms, factories, and balance sheets, a slow erosion that led to this very moment. Tonight we peel back the label, and once you see what's underneath the can, may never feel the same again. The rise of an American icon. Before getting to know its dark side, we need to understand Campbell's origin. Because long before the scandal, long before the recording, this empire didn't just sell soup. It shaped the way America ate, lived, and survived. Campbell's story starts all the way back in 1869, when a fruit merchant named Joseph A. Campbell teamed up with an icebox maker, Abraham Anderson, in Camden, New Jersey. At that time, preserving food was expensive, unreliable, and often unsafe. Families relied on salting, smoking, or whatever they could find in season. Canned goods were still a novelty, the kind of thing you bought only when you had to. But Campbell's saw something different. They saw a future where ordinary families could have safe food, ready food, and cheap food without needing a pharma-cellar or a daily market trip. And that single idea that food could wait for you is what lit the first spark of a billion-dollar empire. As America stepped into the early 1900s, cities grew fast. People clocked in and out of factories, worked long hours, and lived in cramped apartments. Fresh produce wasn't always nearby. Meat wasn't always clean, time wasn't always available, but a can of condensed Campbell's soup. It waited on the shelf, it stayed stable, it fed an entire family for a few cents. When life sped up, Campbell's didn't just fit the moment, it became the moment. By the 1920s, Campbell's condensed soup wasn't just another product. It became a symbol of reliability during unstable times. When the Great Depression hit, millions lost jobs, savings, and stability, but they could still afford a 10-cent can of chicken noodle or tomato soup. And in an era where every penny mattered, that can wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Then came World War II, when rationing shaped every kitchen. Campbell's became essential again. Soldiers carried it. Families depended on it. The brand wasn't selling soup anymore, it was selling reassurance in uncertain years. But the true explosion didn't happen until the post-war boom, the era that created the American middle class. Suburbs expanded, supermarkets filled with bright aisles, homes got bigger, busier, more modern. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, juggling kids' jobs and dinner. And Campbell stepped into that chaos with a promise that felt revolutionary. Dinner doesn't have to take hours. A can opener, a stovetop, in 5 minutes, that was the formula. Convenience became culture. By the 1950s and 60s, Campbell's red and white label wasn't just marketing. It was an American icon instantly recognizable in any pantry. Andy Warhol cemented this forever in 1962, turning the Campbell's soup can into one of the most famous images in modern art. When a brand becomes art, when it becomes a symbol, it stops being food and starts becoming identity. And once a brand becomes an identity, the fall becomes more painful. Through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Campbell's expanded aggressively. Pepperidge Farm joined the family. Goldfish crackers took over lunchboxes. Prego pasta sauce filled suburban kitchens. Campbell's wasn't just soup anymore, it was an empire woven into daily life. A quick lunch, a casserole recipe, a sick day cure. Every family had their memory tied to it. The steam rising from chicken noodle on a winter night. The tomato soup beside a grilled cheese sandwich. The metal clink of the can opener echoing through childhood kitchens. This wasn't advertising, this was routine, this was trust. But as the decades turned, something subtle began to shift. Consumer tastes slowly evolved. Words like fresh, organic, and low sodium started creeping into the national vocabulary. Health trends grew louder. Skepticism toward packaged food increased. And the category Campbell's dominated canned soup became the one most vulnerable to change. Sales started dipping. Households became more demanding. Younger generations didn't reach for cans the way their parents did. The empire wasn't collapsing, but the glow wasn't as bright. And when an icon starts losing relevance, the cracks don't stay quiet for long. Campbell's wasn't failing, not yet. But the world it once ruled was moving faster than the company could adjust. New competitors appeared, fresh meal kits, ready-to-eat bowls, healthier brands, refrigerated soups, all nibbling at Campbell's territory. The product that once fed America now carried a shadow. Has the world outgrown the can? That question, whispered by consumers, analysts, and eventually the company itself, sets the stage for what comes next. Because Campbell's golden age didn't end with a dramatic crash. It ended with a slow fade. The years. Everything started bending. Like many other companies, Campbell had its time. When the market had fewer competitors and fewer complicated choices, the pioneer could dominate almost without trying. But once the aisles filled with rivals, Progresso private label soups, organic brands, microwave bowls, frozen meals, ready-to-eat kits, the giant that once towered over American kitchens suddenly felt small. The market changed faster than Campbell did, and for the first time, the company that fed generations found itself out of breath, confused, and scrambling to reinvent what didn't need reinvention. In the late 70s and into the 90s, the entire packaged food industry went through a shift that reshaped every pantry in America. Corporations merged. Farming got industrial. Shelf life became king. Supermarkets demanded consistency more than character. What counted wasn't the best recipe, it was the most efficient one. Campbell's, like everyone else, had to choose evolve or get eaten. They evolved, but the evolution came with a price. At first, it was subtle. The broth was stretched a little thinner. Vegetables were diced a little smaller. More salt kept the flavor stable. A handful of starches helped everything look the same in every can. No announcement, no fanfare, just quiet adjustments justified by cost models and pressure from the top. Behind the scenes, Campbell's biggest enemy wasn't Progresso or Amy's Organic. It was the company's own quarterly expectations. The crisis became clear when grocery shoppers started wanting fresh, local, and clean label foods. Campbell's didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't built for fresh, it was built for forever. And when your empire depends on cans that can survive both a recession and a nuclear winter, pivoting to transparency becomes a painful process. Internally, this period was marked by a shift that employees still whisper about. Former Campbell's food scientist Michael Durso once said in a public interview, "The pressure wasn't to make the soup better. The pressure was to make it cheaper without anyone noticing." Another ex-staff member quoted anonymously in a Reuters industry piece described the new direction like this. "We used to talk about flavor. Later meetings were about formulas." That mindset didn't make Campbell's evil. It made them predictable. Predictably corporate, predictably defensive, and predictably obsessed with optimization. The rise of bioengineered ingredients only intensified these decisions. They weren't added to harm people. They were added because they were stable, cheap, and consistent. Corn derivatives, modified starches, engineered oils, flavor enhancers, ingredients that behave perfectly under heat-cold shipping and long-term storage. To Wall Street, they were miracles. To consumers, they were invisible. Campbell's was no longer feeding families, it was feeding an inventory system. As the formulas evolved, what was inside the can drifted further from what Americans imagined. Sodium crept upward to levels that made dietitians shake their heads. A single serving of some soups carried more salt than a day's recommended intake. Meanwhile, the thick texture that once came from simmering bones and vegetables came from concentrated bases and modified food starch. A well-known nutrition researcher, Dr. Marion Nestle, commented broadly about processed soups, saying, "When companies prioritize shelf life, the ingredient list grows longer, and the food becomes something else entirely." Campbell's was rarely named directly, but everyone knew who she was talking about. The changes were slow, but the brand loyalty masked them. Generations kept buying the same red and white can because it reminded them of childhood warmth. Snow days, quick meals, busy parents, and a simpler America. When you buy nostalgia, you don't read the label. Campbell's understood that advantage, and quietly they leaned on it. Meanwhile, internally, the pressure intensified. Investors wanted speed. Analysts wanted margin growth. Executives wanted wins that could be presented on earnings calls. In a company that produces billions of servings annually, shaving even 1 cent off each can become a headline victory. That's why one former procurement manager told Bloomberg, "Every ingredient was questioned. Can we replace it? Can we stretch it? Can we stabilize it? Can we source it cheaper?" This wasn't sabotage, it was survival in a world where profits mattered more than potatoes. By the time Campbell tried to modernize with new product lines, healthy request low-sodium organic, the ship was already drifting. The core product the red label can had become the company's burden and its lifeline. Too iconic to change, too outdated to grow, too profitable to abandon. And this is the atmosphere that made the next chapter possible. Because when a company stops talking about food and starts talking about numbers, eventually someone somewhere inside will slip and say what they really think about the product they're selling. The mask is cracking from here. When the mask slipped. A company usually erodes slowly. Reputation fades grain by grain. But Campbell's didn't crumble like that. Its collapse began in a single night, triggered by one recorded conversation and one can of soup small enough to fit in your palm. To understand the scale of what followed, we first needed to know who was speaking on that recording. Martin Bally wasn't a random employee. He was Campbell's vice president and chief information security officer, a senior executive with access to internal systems, sensitive documents, and company-wide strategy. In a corporation founded in 1869, Bally sat at the top of a modern division responsible for protecting its digital backbone. His job required discipline, caution, and loyalty, the last person anyone expected to ignite a national firestorm. Yet he did. The recording wasn't meant for the world. It began as a quiet dinner between Bally and a newly hired cybersecurity analyst, Robert Garza, who believed they were meeting to discuss his salary. Michigan is a one-party consent state, and when Garza sensed something off, he tapped the record. In that moment, without knowing it, he captured the most damaging corporate monologue Campbell's had faced in decades. Over the next 75 minutes, Bally tore into the brand he represented. He mocked customers, dismissed employees, criticized products, and admitted with no hesitation that he avoided Campbell's food entirely. "Who buys our kitchen?" he said. "I don't buy it anymore. It's not healthy. Now that I know what the is in it." He referenced ingredients as if they belonged in a lab, not in a century-old household brand. When the public later heard these words, the reaction wasn't outrage first, it was shock. As one analyst told ABC the next morning, people believe him because he had absolutely no reason to lie at that moment. The recording didn't stop at product insults. Bally went further, describing colleagues of Indian descent with slurs, questioning their competence, and admitting that he had once shown up to work after consuming THC edibles. These weren't slips of frustration. They were unfiltered truths from a senior executive who assumed no one was listening. Garza did what any employee is instructed to do. He filed a complaint. In January 2025, he submitted the evidence of discriminatory behavior, degrading comments, and unprofessional conduct. Instead of an investigation, he was fired in 20 days. No warnings, no performance issues, no follow-up from HR. He spent nearly 10 months unemployed before filing a lawsuit alleging retaliation and a racially hostile environment. Then came the moment Campbell's feared most. The recording leaked. Within hours, the story surged across CBS, NBC, AP, News People, Fortune, and every mid-market station from Detroit to Tampa. Bally was placed on leave. Campbell issued a textbook crisis statement. "The comments do not reflect our values." They called the claims about 3D printed chicken absurd and emphasized USDA-approved suppliers and quality standards. But no PR line could soften the blow. The public had already heard the truth, not from an activist, not from a competitor, but from one of Campbell's own executives. The fallout spread faster than Campbell's expected. Florida's Attorney General launched a consumer protection investigation, citing the state's ban on lab-grown meat. The timing was terrible. Campbell's had spent years fighting the perception that their foods were overprocessed. Now a top executive seemed to confirm every suspicion consumers whispered about for a decade. Stocks dipped, comment sections turned vicious, and something deeper snapped, not in the financials but in the emotional contract between Campbell's and the American household. Grandmothers who had bought the same chicken noodle soup for 40 years suddenly questioned what was inside. Parents reread labels. People wondered what else Campbell's never said aloud. Because loyalty doesn't die when recipes change. It dies when people learn what the company truly thinks of them. And after that night, Campbell's wasn't facing a PR problem. It was facing a crisis of trust, one ignited by its own leadership, captured on a phone and impossible to take back. The domino collapse. By now, you must have guessed the tremendous impact of Bally's words. But trust me, things got even worse than that. What looked like one executive losing control turned out to be the first push in a long chain of falling dominoes, each one louder, heavier, and more destructive than the last. The shift in public feeling happened almost instantly. Within 48 hours of the audio leak, Google searches for Campbell's scandal spiked more than 700% according to Google Trends. TikTok was flooding with stitches of people reacting to Bally's voice. Hashtags mocking 3D printed chicken gained hundreds of thousands of views. And comment sections underneath Campbell's ads, the ones that usually sat empty, suddenly turned into battlegrounds. The soup that had once symbolized comfort now carried the aftertaste of distrust. This wasn't just a PR problem, it was a psychological break. Because Campbell's didn't sell luxury, they sold childhood, snow days, sick days, after-school meals. When a product like that is questioned, the wound runs deeper. As one food industry analyst told Fortune, when nostalgia is damaged, recovery is nearly impossible. The markets felt it next. Campbell's Soup Company had reported $9.4 billion in annual revenue before the scandal broke a figure built on steady grocery store reliability rather than excitement. That stability evaporated in a matter of days. Shares dipped as traders reacted to the audio of the lawsuit and Florida's announcement of an investigation. Investors hate uncertainty, and this wasn't ordinary uncertainty. This was a senior executive openly insulting the very product line that generated half of the company's net sales. And if the scandal had hit 10 years earlier, Campbell's might have weathered it. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The canned soup category has been shrinking for years. Younger consumers are buying fewer processed foods. Inflation pushed shoppers toward cheaper private label brands. Competitors like Progresso and Amy's gained ground by positioning themselves as cleaner or fresher. So when the scandal exploded, it didn't land on a strong foundation. It landed on cracks that were already running deep. Inside the company, panic spread behind the polished statements. Employees leaked messages describing confusion and fear. Managers were told to restrict commentary, a familiar sign that damage control had replaced strategy. Some staff privately wondered whether more recordings existed. Others questioned how a VP climbed so high while harboring those views. HR, already strained, was suddenly the center of a storm. Externally, pressure mounted from every direction. Garza's lawsuit wasn't a small HR dispute. It was a legally documented claim of retaliation, discrimination, and failure to investigate. Florida's Attorney General publicly announced an inquiry not just into the recording, but into whether Campbell's products complied with recently strengthened state rules on lab-grown or bioengineered ingredients. The soup giant now had political heat, legal heat, and social heat all at once, and retailers were watching. Grocery chains may not remove a brand immediately, but they do something far more damaging. They quietly shift shelf space. They reduce end cap placements. They cut price promotions. A brand with negative public sentiment becomes a risky bet. Campbell's, once a guaranteed sale, suddenly felt vulnerable in aisles they used to dominate. But the real damage surfaced in consumer behavior. People picked up the can and flipped it around. They read the ingredients with suspicion. They questioned labels they had never questioned before. Contains bioengineered food ingredients printed clearly on several Campbell's products became the center of jokes, duets, reaction videos. A line that had existed for years was now interpreted as a confession. Sales analysts noticed increased chatter around competitors, especially brands emphasizing real organic or no artificial ingredients. When consumers start migrating emotionally, the financial migration always follows. Because when trust breaks, customers don't argue, they disappear. The Bally recording didn't create a new problem for Campbell's, it revealed one. And once it was revealed, everything the company had ignored, postponed, minimized, or downplayed came crashing down at once: reputation, confidence, market security, and the nostalgic bond that once protected them like armor. But a scandal is only the surface. What people heard that night wasn't the root, it was the spark. The real question lies deeper. What had Campbell been hiding long before Bally ever opened his mouth? What's actually inside those cans? Before anyone ever heard the leaked recording, consumers were already whispering the same uncomfortable thought. Something about Campbell's soup didn't taste the way it used to. And when the scandal exploded, people finally dug deeper into the cans, sitting in their kitchen cupboards. What they found wasn't rumor or speculation, it was printed right there on the label. A single serving of classic Campbell's chicken noodle contains 600 to 900 milligrams of sodium. Most people eat the entire can, not half. That means one bowl can deliver nearly 2,000 milligrams of sodium in one sitting, more than the American Heart Association's recommended daily limit. For millions who grew up trusting this soup as a safe, nostalgic comfort, this realization hit like a splash of cold water. And sodium was only the beginning. Modified food starch, monosodium glutamate, potassium chloride sugar, added to savory soups, and vague natural flavors appeared across multiple product lines. None of these are illegal, none are hidden. Yet the combination created an uncomfortable contrast. The brand that once sold itself as wholesome was drifting toward the same industrial formulation style as the competitors it used to rise above. The bioengineered ingredients line, now required by U.S. labeling law, only sharpened the unease. The statement is true and legally correct, reflecting soy, corn, and oil derivatives found in many mass-produced foods. But after the Bally scandal, the phrase took on a life of its own. Customers held up cans and wondered what else they had missed. A single line barely larger than the allergy warning had become an emotional tripwire. Behind those ingredients was a deeper problem: years of quiet restructuring. Between 2015 and 2019, Campbell's launched cost-cutting programs exceeding $500 million. Plants closed. Recipes were reformulated. Over 700 jobs were eliminated. These moves were meant to stabilize a struggling company in a declining category, but every cut pushed the product further from what made it iconic. A former employee described it simply: "We weren't making bad soup, we were making cheaper soup." Customers noticed. Reviews across major retailers reflect a steady shift from loyalty to frustration. Some complained about watery texture, others said their favorite flavors tasted flat. A few insisted the soup seemed thinner than before. Not catastrophic on its own, but collectively these comments told the story of a brand losing the emotional advantage it once held. Meanwhile, the market was changing faster than Campbell could adapt. Younger shoppers were migrating to fresh soups, meal kits, and premium brands with cleaner labels. Health-conscious consumers favored low-sodium alternatives. Analysts reported a long-term decline in canned soup consumption, while Campbell's own documents acknowledged a reduction in household penetration. In plain terms, fewer families were buying the red and white can. All of this created a pressure chamber waiting to blow. When Bally's comments surfaced, dismissive, reckless, and dripping with contempt, the public didn't start questioning Campbell's. They continued a process they had already begun. The scandal didn't create suspicion, it confirmed it. Regulators soon entered the picture. Florida's Attorney General launched an inquiry into Campbell's products, drawing national attention. Commentary in the media resurfaced past disputes over labeling claims, including a 2010 clash with federal regulators over sodium reduction marketing. The message was unmistakable. Once the trust barrier broke, every old question returned with sharper teeth. By the end of this period, Campbell's wasn't just dealing with a PR nightmare. It was confronting a consumer base that felt misled, a market that had moved on, and a product lineup caught between nostalgia and modern expectations. The cracks were no longer hidden inside the can, they were spreading into the company's foundation. And as those cracks widened, the financial consequences finally arrived, heavy and unforgiving. The inside story: who let Campbell fall? From the surface, you may think Martin Bally is the origin. His rant, his words, his behavior, they're easy targets. But to reach a fair conclusion, we need to look deeper, because no single executive can damage a century-old company on his own. Scandals like this don't rise from one voice. They rise from a culture that silently allows it. Inside Campbell's walls, the truth is far more disturbing than one viral recording. When a company collapses publicly, it's only because something has already collapsed quietly from within. And in Campbell's case, every layer designed to prevent disaster was already fraying long before the world heard what was said at that restaurant table. The moment the whistleblower Robert Garza reported the misconduct in January 2025, the real story began to reveal itself. HR didn't immediately launch a protective process. Compliance didn't begin a documented investigation. Leadership didn't freeze the situation to preserve evidence or interview witnesses. None of the systems built to uphold ethics moved with urgency. Instead, the one who reported the misconduct was terminated within the same month. It wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom. Across American workplaces, whistleblower retaliation claims have surged more than 50% since 2020. Campbell's didn't resist that trend. They followed it precisely. This wasn't just internal miscommunication, it was structural failure. HR is supposed to guard employee safety. Compliance is supposed to enforce accountability. Leadership is supposed to respond with neutrality. But here each function stalled, hesitated, or shut down entirely. That never happens by accident. It happens when a culture has been rigid for too long, when dissent is seen as danger, and when uncomfortable truths are treated as threats rather than warnings. And the cracks didn't begin with the soup scandal. For years, former employees had been raising concerns. On job review sites and in private forums, workers described Campbell's as slow to adapt, deeply hierarchical, resistant to new ideas, and internally divided. Several said the culture encouraged nod-along behavior, agreeing with leadership, even when decisions made little sense. In 2018, long before the current crisis, investor Dan Loeb's Third Point publicly criticized Campbell's for being insular, unaccountable, and stuck in outdated governance. That warning went unaddressed. Corporate culture doesn't collapse overnight. It softens first. People stop speaking honestly. Meetings become ceremonial. Bad news is tucked under slides. Employees learn which topics can be raised and which ones end careers. Over time, the company becomes more and more concerned with maintaining appearances than maintaining integrity. And when that shift happens, risk increases quietly, silently, inevitably. So when misconduct was reported, the system didn't question the behavior. It questioned the whistleblower. Retaliation became faster than reflection. Fear became louder than principle. And only when the recording spread across social media did the company reverse course and announce an investigation. By that point, the internal damage was complete. Employees had seen what happened to the person who spoke up. Investors had seen how slowly leadership responded. Regulators had seen how reactive the company became. And the public had seen a brand scrambling to contain consequences it could no longer control. Once internal trust disappears, information stops flowing in the right direction. Problems stay buried. Employees detach emotionally. Turnover rises. Productivity sinks. Leaks become frequent. And suddenly a company isn't managing a crisis, it's feeding one. Campbell's didn't fall because of one man. It fell because every guardrail that should have stopped him had already rotted away. With a foundation this unstable, with a culture this fragile, and with an entire workforce watching from the inside. The comeback that never came. After mistakes, everyone tries to fix them to patch the holes, steady the ship, and pretend life can return to normal. Campbell was no exception, but the truth hit harder than they expected. The damage ran too deep, the distrust spread too fast, and no short-term remedy could mend what had already broken. In the weeks after the scandal, Campbell moved exactly the way a legacy giant would. They reinforced ingredient claims, reminded shoppers that their chicken was USDA approved, and quietly tightened supplier checks. But those were only surface moves. The real effort, the one they hoped would win back American households, came through the product itself. If they couldn't clean up the narrative, they'd try to clean up the can. Inside the company, a quality reset began rolling out. Sodium levels were reconsidered. Vegetable content increased in a handful of recipes. Broths were refined. Labels were refreshed with bigger claims of real ingredients and no antibiotics ever. Packaging was modernized, softened, polished, as if a gentler design could soften the public's anger. They launched ingredient transparency pages online explaining where their chicken, carrots, and spices came from. To management, these choices were proof of action. To shoppers, they were barely a whisper. Because while Campbell was making incremental improvements, the rest of the industry was sprinting. Progresso pushed seasonal flavors and cleaner recipes. Pacific Foods expanded organic SKUs. Store-brand soups, once an afterthought, surged as inflation pushed shoppers toward cheaper alternatives. In many major retailers, private labels grew 7 to 11% year over year, while Campbell's core categories grew only 1 to 3% during a period when inflation alone ran higher. Adjusted for real dollars, that meant decline the kind you can't hide behind corporate optimism. But numbers only tell part of the story. The deeper problem sat in the psychology of trust. Fixing a can of soup is easy. Fixing the belief behind it is nearly impossible once it's cracked. Modern consumers don't reward quiet corrections. They demand visible accountability, cultural honesty, and emotional sincerity. Campbell offered tweaks, not transformation. And the scandal didn't simply question ingredients, it questioned integrity. When a vice president says he wouldn't eat the product, any recipe adjustment becomes white noise. Even more damaging was how invisible the improvements were. The recipe tasted the same to most people. The labels didn't feel radically different. The shelves looked unchanged. And so consumers assumed nothing had changed. Social media conversations about Campbell's quality stayed negative for months. Sentiment tracking across Brandwatch and Meltwater monitored categories showed improvement in words like taste and value, but not in trust, which continued to trend downward long after the scandal cooled. In the age of viral exposure, reputation doesn't erode gradually anymore. It collapses in an instant, and rebuilding it takes far more than a redesigned can. Investors felt that shift early. By the time the dust settled, analysts were openly discussing something Campbell had avoided for decades: whether the brand still carried cultural weight, whether canned soup meant comfort anymore, whether nostalgia could still protect a company built in 1869 from a marketplace that now demanded transparency, freshness, convenience, and authenticity all at once. Younger shoppers disappeared, choosing microwavable bowls, high-protein soups, or fresh alternatives. Campbell looked old, slow, and reactionary, not wrong necessarily, but outdated. That's the most tragic part of this entire episode. Campbell didn't just face a scandal, they faced a world that had outrun them. Their fixes were practical, traditional, sensible, and completely mismatched to the moment. The scandal exposed a brand unprepared for a modern crisis, still fighting yesterday's battles with yesterday's tools. This video is long enough already. So before we wrap, I want to end with a simple, honest reflection, my humble view on this infamous, strangely pitiful chapter in American food history. The bigger truth behind Campbell's collapse. From a distance, it's easy to think Campbell fell because of one reckless executive and one viral recording. But when you look closer, when you track the company's path over the last 20 years, you start to realize the scandal was only the spark, not the fire. The real story sits beneath the headlines in the slow erosion of a brand that once fed America's soul and somehow forgot how to feed its future. Campbell did not collapse overnight, it drifted. For years, the company relied on a playbook written in the 20th century nostalgia mass production and the belief that loyalty would outlive change. And in a different era, maybe that would have been enough. But the marketplace kept evolving and Campbell kept turning the same pages. While consumer tastes shifted toward freshness and transparency, Campbell pushed comfort and consistency. While competitors raced to release cleaner recipes, organic lines, and modern flavors, Campbell continued polishing a legacy that no longer matched the appetite of a new generation. That gap between past and present widened quietly. Sales softened. Younger shoppers walked past the canned aisle. Private labels strengthened. And though Campbell introduced improvements, reduced sodium, ingredient transparency, Modernized, labeling the changes moved too slowly for a world conditioned by rapid innovation. In a landscape where Progresso Pacific Foods and even store brands sprinted, Campbell moved like a heavyweight tied to its own history. So when the Bally tape exploded online, it didn't create the distrust, it confirmed it. His words landed on a company already struggling to justify its place on modern shelves. Consumers didn't just hear an executive mocking the product, they heard something they had already begun to suspect, that Campbell itself had stopped believing in what it sold. That's why the backlash hit with the force of a cultural verdict. The scandal didn't expose a bad moment, it exposed a weakening foundation. Trust today doesn't behave the way it used to. Decades ago, a strong brand could survive anything. Now trust depends on proof, sourcing, transparency, ingredient honesty, visible accountability. The companies that thrive are the ones that open their kitchens to the world. Campbell kept its doors closed too long, and when they were forced open, people didn't like the smell. But beneath all the corporate numbers and headlines lies something more human. Something that explains why this case drew so much attention. Campbell wasn't just a soup brand. It was childhood lunches, sick days at home, winter nights, and millions of kitchens. When a product carries that much emotional memory, its fall feels personal. People weren't angry because the soup was flawed. They were angry because they once trusted it without question. And that's the real tragedy of Campbell's story. Not the scandal, not the sales drop. It's the realization that a brand built on warmth and comfort slowly drifted away from the values that made it iconic. The fall wasn't sudden. It was quiet, gradual, and strangely inevitable. In the end, Campbell's story isn't just about a scandal, a lawsuit, or a can of soup that went viral for all the wrong reasons. It's a reminder of something deeper, that in the food industry, honesty is not optional, and persistence is not a slogan. They are survival. Anyone can chase profit. Anyone can redesign a label, hire a new PR team, or shout about quality from the rooftops. But the brands that endure are the ones willing to tell the truth, fix what's broken, and keep showing up, even when it hurts their bottom line. Food was never meant to be a battlefield of marketing tricks or margins squeezed to the bone. It has always been a war of will. The will to stay transparent, to stay humble, and to respect the people who trust you enough to put your product on their table. Campbell forgot that. Others shouldn't.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage segregation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today analyzes made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.